Lesson 40. Adverbs, their formation and comparison. Use of adverbs. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 120, and we've made it all the way to lesson 40, so we're over halfway through the book. Today we're going to focus on adverbs, and we're going to see how they're formed and how we can make the comparative and superlative forms of adverbs. So let's jump right into section 322, where it says formation of adverbs. Adverbs are derived chiefly from adjectives. So in Latin, we have a couple of ways of converting an adjective to an adverb, and we do the same thing in English. In English, oftentimes we add ly to an adjective to create an adverb. For example, if I say that someone is quick, the word quick is an adjective. But if I say that someone is doing something quickly, the word quickly is no longer an adjective. I've added ly to the end, and now it's an adverb. So the word quickly modifies a verb, not a noun. So in English, we can change an adjective into an adverb by adding ly. In Latin, you'll see here in section A of section 322, it says, some are derived from adjectives of the first and second declension by adding e to the base. So in English, we can add ly. In Latin, you can add an e to the base or stem of an adjective and get an adverb that way. And they give an example here, latus, that's a first and second declension adjective. That means wide. So latus, lata, latum. The stem or base of the adjective is lat. So if you add an e, that is a long e, to that stem or base, that gives you latte. Not like the coffee drink you get at a coffee shop, but latte meaning widely. So that's one way to create an adjective in Latin. Another way is described here in section B. It says here, some are derived from adjectives of the third declension by adding ter or iter to the base. So if you have a third declension adjective, such as gravis, we can take the genitive stem, which is grav, and we can add, in this case, iter and get graviter. So gravis as an adjective means heavy. Graviter as an adverb means heavily. Likewise, prudens, which means prudent, can become prudenter, which means prudently. Don't pay too much attention to the way they're saying that they're adding ter or iter to the base or the stem, because I'm not defining the stem in quite the same way they are. I'm looking at the stem as the genitive stem, but they seem to be viewing it some other way here. Let's move on now to section 323 and look at how we can make the comparative forms and superlative forms of adverbs. Let's read the text they have here. Adverbs are compared thus. The comparative is the neuter comparative of the adjective. The superlative is the superlative of the adjective with final us changed to a long e. So this is really not too difficult. Let's just take these one at a time. On the first line, we have latte, which means widely. That's just latus, lata, or latum with a long e at the end as its ending. The comparative form, again, is the neuter comparative of the adjective. In the past few lessons, we've studied that the comparative form of an adjective is a third declension adjective, and that the neuter nominative singular form has ius. And so that neuter nominative singular form with ius, that's the same as the adverb. So latius here means more widely. And finally, latissime, that's just the first and second declension adjective, latissimus, latissima, latissimum, with the ending changed to a long e. So widely, more widely, most widely is latte, latius, latissime. And latissime as the superlative form could also be translated as very widely. Next line we have libere, which means freely. liberius, which means more freely, and liberame, which means most freely or very freely. Next we have facile, which means easily, facilius, more easily, facilime is most easily or very easily. Again, the comparative form is the same as the neuter comparative form of the adjective. Graviter means heavily, gravius means more heavily, gravissime means most heavily or very heavily. On the next line we have bene, which means well. Melius is the comparative, which means more well. It's kind of hard to translate. And optime means very well, or perhaps done in the best way. So it's kind of hard to translate. I guess we could say as a joke, bestly, but that is not really a word. Next we have male, which means, as they have here, ill, or we might also say poorly or badly. Peius means worse in an adverbial kind of way, worsely, or more badly. And pessime means most badly or very badly. On the next line, you'll see we have magis as a comparative that means more. And as I told you in the past, magis is adverbial, so it can modify action. And I gave the example of saying, I exercise more, or perhaps I exercise more than someone else. So for that kind of adverb of saying more, you would say magis. And so that's what you see here in the chart. And maxime is the superlative form. That means most. Multum plus and plurimum means much, more, much, like mucher. On the next line, parum, which means little in an adverbial way. Minus means less in an adverbial way. And then minime means least. Oftentimes, when you see minime on its own, you'll see it meaning something like not at all. In fact, you can answer questions using the word minime. If someone asks you in Latin, hey, did you go here or there yesterday? You can say minime, not at all, meaning that you did not do that. Next we have diu, which means for a long time, diutius for a longer time, ditissime for a very long time. Prope means near, propius, nearer, proxime means nearest, or perhaps very near. Finally, we have saipe, which means often, saipius, which means more often, and saipissime, which means very often. Moving on to section 324, the authors of the book would like us to notice the different roles that an adverb can play. So let's read what they have here. In the expressions fortiter pugnat, mages idoneus, and minus facile, notice that an adverb modifies the verb pugnat, the adjective idoneus, and the adverb facile. So they want to point out to us here that an adverb can modify a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. So let's take a look at these examples one at a time here in section 324. Fortiter pugnat. Well, the word pugnat is a verb. That's pugno, which means fight. And pugnat is third person singular present tense. So it means he, she, or it fights, or he, she, or it is fighting. And fortiter is the adverbial form of fortis, which means brave. So fortiter means bravely. So fortiter pugnat says he, she, or it is fighting bravely. So in this example, we have an adverb, fortiter, modifying a verb, which is pugnat. Next, mages idoneus. Idoneus is an adjective that means suitable. Mages means more in an adverbial kind of way. So mages idoneus means more suitable. In a previous lesson, it was either last lesson or the one before, they taught us that mages works along with idoneus as kind of a special adverb plus adjective kind of construction. Finally, we have minus facile. Facile means easily. That's an adverb from facilis. And then minus means less. That's a comparative adverb. So we have a comparative adverb, minus, modifying an adverb, facile. And so together they say less easily. So they're showing us here that adverbs can function in different ways. They can play different roles. They can modify verbs. In some special cases, they can modify adjectives. And they can also modify other adverbs. In fact, that's the rule they tell us here in section 325. It says here, an adverb may modify a verb, adjective, or another adverb. So they just want you to be aware of the different things that an adverb can do. Let's move on now to section 326, which is our vocabulary section for this lesson. The first word here is bibrakte. That's a third declension noun. It's a proper noun, which is the name of a town. It says here, a town of the Haidui. As you go through Caesar's Gallic Wars, you should know that the tribe known as the Haidui were considered allies of the Romans. And in many texts, the name Haidui is spelled without the letter H at the front. I've seen it often as Idui. So if you're looking in other textbooks or other reference books and you see Idui, that's the same as Haidui. For some reason, the authors of this book like to spell it with an H. I'm not sure why. So Bibrakte is a town of the Haidui, or Idui. That's a tribe that was allied with Rome. So Rome had some kind of diplomatic relationship with them. Next, we have plebs, plebis. That means the common people, not the aristocrats, not the top level of social rank, but just the common people. That's a feminine noun of the third declension. Acceptus, accepta, acceptum means pleasing or popular with. Copiosus, copiosa, copiosum. That's a first and second declension adjective. That means wealthy. It's related to the word copia, which can mean supplies. Next we have audax, audacis. That's a third declension adjective. We have the English word audacity, which is related to this adjective. Finally, we have a couple of verbs here. Con loco is a first conjugation verb, which means to place or station. We've already seen a couple of verbs that can mean to place or station, like pono, constituo, and so now we have yet another one, con loco. Next we have permitto, which is simply the verb mitto, which means to send, compounded with the prefix per. And permitto means to entrust, allow, or permit. Notice that the authors of the book have spelled the word entrust with an I. I think these days we would spell it with an E, like E-N-T-R-U-S-T. But anyway, you can see that our English word permit is related to permitto. Let's move on now to our translation section for this lesson. That's section 327. Turn off the recording and go ahead and do all the exercises here. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework here in section 327. Let's go over these exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, minime saepe. Here we have the adverb saepe, which means often, but it's being modified by another adverb, the adverb minime. Minime can mean least, or it can mean not at all. Here I think the idea is least. So number 1 adds up to least often. Again, remember that these are all adverbs, which are describing action and activity. So if you have 3 grandsons and they don't visit their grandma very often, the one that visits grandma least of all, you could say that he visits grandma minime saepe, least often. Number 2 is next. Belgae a provincia longissime absunt. The subject here is Belgae. That means the Belgians, members of the Gallic tribe known as the Belgae. And absunt is the verb. That's the verb absum. It's simply the verb sum, the verb of being, but with ab prefixed to the front of it. And it means to be absent or to be from somewhere in the sense of being away from. So what we have so far would say the Belgians are absent or the Belgians are away. And then we have a provincia. That means from the province. In what would today be the south of France, the Romans had a big area known as provincia, which simply means the province. That name survives today because that area of France is called Provence, which comes from the word provincia. So what we have so far says the Belgians are away from the province. Finally, we have an adverb modifying the action of being away, and that's longissime. Longissime means longest or perhaps farthest. So literally, number 2 says, the Belgians are away from the province farthestly. Okay, that's literally what it's saying, but to put it into smooth English, we need to mess with it a bit. Another way to say it in kind of a wooden, literal fashion would be, the Belgians are away from the province most longly. But that's terrible English, not even correct English. So if we wanted to put this into smooth English, we could say the Belgians are the farthest away from the province. Now keep in mind that's not literal at all. We're changing things around, but that's probably the best way to put it into English. Number 3 is next. Continenter bellum gerunt. We've studied this idiom many times, bellum gerunt. We know that bellum and gero together mean to wage war. So gerunt is third person plural. So bellum and gerunt together will say they are waging war. And the adverb continenter means continually. So number 3 says they are waging war continually. Number 4 is next. Orgeterix facilios eis persuasit. The subject here is Orgeterix. We talked about him in the last lesson. Persuasit means he, she, or it persuaded. It's perfect tense. And persuadeo, as a verb, takes the dative case. And so eis is dative plural, working along with persuasit. We can translate eis as them. It's a form of is-ea id. And facilios is a comparative adverb. So literally, number 4 could say this. Orgeterix persuaded them more easily, but it might sound a bit smoother to translate this comparative using the word rather. We could say, perhaps, Orgeterix persuaded them rather easily. That would sound a bit smoother. Number 5 is next. Minus late. Here we have an adverb modifying another adverb. Late means widely. And then minus is a comparative adverb modifying late. So number 5 says something like less widely. In number 6, we have the word minus again. That's an adverb that means less. It's a comparative adverb. Here it's modifying facile, which means easily. So number 6 says less easily. Minus facile was one of the examples they gave us up in section 324 to demonstrate that an adverb can modify another adverb. Number 7 is next. Orgeterix maxime plebi acceptus erat. The subject here is Orgeterix. The verb is erat, which means he, she, or it was. That's an imperfect tense. And then acceptus means popular or pleasing. That's a predicate adjective. So what we have so far would say Orgeterix was pleasing or Orgeterix was popular. Then we have the word plebi in the dative singular. That's one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Plebs and plebis means the common people. It's dative because it's working along with acceptus. So acceptus means pleasing or popular, and then plebi means toward or with the common people. So acceptus is working with the dative case. To me, this looks like an example of dative with adjectives, which we learned about a lesson or two ago. But anyway, what we have so far would say, Orgetrix was popular with the common people. Or perhaps Orgetrix was pleasing to the common people. Now we have the adverb maxime, which means most. So we could translate it as Orgetrix was most pleasing to the common people, or Orgetrix was most popular with the common people. That doesn't really sound very good. I think the flavor of this word maxime here is something like very. It's just strengthening the strength of the wording here. So, in fact, I'm not sure if maxime is modifying erat or acceptus. It could be saying Orgetrix was very greatly pleasing to the common people. Or it could be modifying acceptus, and it could be saying Orgetrix was very popular with the common people. Regardless of which word maxime is modifying, it gives us still roughly the same translation. Number 8 is next. Nostri cum Helvetiis proelium cupidius committunt. The subject here is nostri. That means our, as in O-U-R. And that's a substantive. It means our troops, our people, our guys, our men, something like that. So when you translate it, you have to read into that the idea of men or troops. This is how Caesar describes his own troops, or the Roman troops, oftentimes in Caesar's Gallic Wars. And the verb here is committunt. The literal meaning of the verb committunt, it's the verb committo, which is con plus mitto. Literally, it means to send together. So it can mean to join in. Along with proelium, which means battle, it has the idea of engaging in battle or joining in battle. So our subject and verb, and then proelium, which is really a direct object, would say this: our men are joining battle, in the sense of they're going to battle with someone. Cum Helvetiis means with the Helvetii, and cupidius is a comparative adverb. Cupidus means desirous, so cupide would mean desirously as an adverb, and then cupidius would be the comparative adverb form of that. So cupidius means something like more desirously. Here it might sound better to translate it with the word rather. So number 8 could say, our men are joining battle with the Helvetii rather desirously, or perhaps rather eagerly. Again, cupidius is a comparative adverb. Number 9 is next. Audacius pugnant. The verb here is pugnant, which means they are fighting, or they fight. There is no dedicated noun here to be the subject, so we need to just use the word they that's present in the verb. So the subject and verb together would say they fight or they are fighting, and audacius is a comparative adverb. In fact, it's based on one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. In this lesson, we have the word audax, which means bold, and so audacius is a comparative adverb of audax. So it means more boldly or rather boldly. So number 9 could say they are fighting more boldly, or it could say they are fighting rather boldly. Number 10 is next. Caesar graviter principes accusat. Our verb here is accusat. That's the verb accuso, which means to find fault with or to accuse. It's third person singular present tense, and the subject is Caesar. So the subject and verb will say Caesar is accusing or Caesar is finding fault with. And the people that he's accusing are the principes. That's the leaders or the chiefs, the people in charge, in other words. We can translate it simply as leaders. And then graviter is an adverb that means heavily or severely. So number 10 says, Caesar is severely accusing the leaders. Number 11 is next, multo gravius. The word gravius is a comparative. It could be an adverb or it could be an adjective. If it's an adjective, it would be neuter nominative singular and would say heavier or rather heavy. If it's an adverb, it would say more heavily or rather heavily. Since we're working on adverbs here, it's probably an adverb. So let's treat it as if it's an adverb. And so we'll translate it as more heavily or more severely. And multo means something like by much. Since it's ablative singular, it looks like an ablative of degree of difference. So we could translate 11 as more severely by far or more severely by much. Of course, a smoother translation would be something like much more severely. Number 12 is next. Liscus dicit liberius atque audacius. The subject here is liscus, that's someone's name. Dicit is third person singular. It means he, she, or it is speaking. So the subject and verb will say liscus is speaking or liscus speaks. And then we have a couple of adverbs telling us how he is speaking. Liberius is a comparative adverb. That's in our chart on page 120 on the second line. So liberius would say something like rather freely or perhaps more freely. And audacius is an adverb based on one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson, which is audax. Audax means bold. So audacius as a comparative means something like more boldly. So number 12 could say, Liscus is speaking more freely and more boldly. But instead of making a comparison like that, there's no one really to compare him to. So it could just be saying, Liscus is speaking rather freely and rather boldly. The word atque simply means and. In the glossary, it says to translate it as and also. So number 12 could say, Liscus is speaking rather freely and also rather boldly. Number 13 is next. A bibracte opido haeduorum longe maximo et copiosissimo. Caesar aberat. The subject here is Caesar. The verb is aberat. That's imperfect tense, third person singular. And so it means he, she, or it was absent or he, she, or it was away. And then the prepositional phrase a bibracte says from bibracte. So what we have so far would say Caesar was away from bibracte. Then the rest of the sentence will tell us more about bibracte. The word opido is standing in apposition with bibracte. Notice that bibracte is ablative singular because it's the object of the preposition a, and opido is ablative singular because it's standing in apposition with bibracte. Remember that apposition is when you just pile up more nouns to describe something. So what we have so far would say, Caesar was away from bibracte, a town. Okay, so the word opido is in a positive, telling us more about bibracte. Haeduorum is possessing opido, that means of the haedui. So what we have so far would say, Caesar was away from bibracte, a town of the haedui. Now we have a couple of superlative adjectives to describe the opido. Maximo means greatest or largest. And copiosissimo, well, that's one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Copiosus, copiosa, copiosum means well supplied or wealthy. So copiosissimo is a superlative that means wealthiest. The word longe means by far. So number 13 altogether says, Caesar was away from bibracte, a town of the haedui, by far. the greatest and wealthiest. If you want to switch around the English word order, you can do that. You could say, Caesar was away from Bibracte, by far the largest and wealthiest town of the Haidui. Number 14 is next. In sumo jugo suas legiones, quas in Gallia citeriore proxime conscripserat, et omnia auxilia conlocavit. This sentence has 2 or 3 different parts. In the middle, you'll notice a relative clause starting with quas and going up through the word conscripserat. But the main verb here is conlocavit. There is no explicitly stated subject here. In other words, there's no dedicated noun here to be the subject. So we have to go with the pronoun that we find in conlocavit. It's obviously talking about Julius Caesar, but it doesn't state his name. So conlocavit is actually a form of one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Conloco means to place or station, and conlocavit is perfect tense, third person singular. So conlocavit says he, she, or it placed, or he, she, or it stationed. In a military context, you might say he, she, or it deployed. And so we have 2 different direct objects here. One is legiones, which means legions. And then the other is auxilia, which means auxiliary troops like cavalry. So conlocavit, legiones, and auxilia, those 3 words form a kind of a skeleton of the sentence. And that skeleton would read as follows. He stationed legions and auxiliary troops. We have a prepositional phrase here, in sumo jugo. Jugo is a form of the second declension neuter noun jugum, which means yoke. That's Y-O-K-E. For example, when you put a yoke onto 2 oxen or 2 beasts of burden, it's a piece of wood that joins them together. And that same word can also mean the ridge of a mountain. If you go to the very top of a mountain and there's a sort of a pointy area where the top of one side ends and you start to go down the other side of the mountain, that pointy sort of blade area at the top, that's called a ridge. And so in Latin, the same word that means yoke for animals can also mean the ridge at the top of mountains. So in and jugo together will say on the ridge. And along with sumo here, it looks like it's saying on the highest ridge. But remember that this is the way an ancient Roman would say at the top of the ridge. Okay, so in sumo jugo, we'll say something like at the top of the ridge. You know, the highest part of the ridge. Not the highest ridge, but the top of the ridge. That's the idea of what's being communicated here. And suas is modifying legiones. So suas legiones says his own legions. So what we have so far says he stationed his own legions at the top of the ridge, and he stationed all the auxiliary troops. So one verb here with 2 direct objects. Now let's take a look at our relative clause here. That's quas in Gallia citeriore proxime conscripserat. Conscripserat is a form of the verb conscribo, which means to enlist or draft or conscript. It's when you require people to supply troops. This is pluperfect tense, so conscripserat will say something like, he had drafted. Quas is the direct object of conscripserat, so we'll translate quas as whom or which, and it's referring back to legiones. The noun legio is a feminine noun of the third declension. Remember that most of the time, third declension nouns that end with io are feminine. So quas is the relative pronoun that starts out our relative clause. Quas is feminine because the antecedent legiones is feminine. It's plural because the antecedent legiones is plural, but it's accusative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. So quas is accusative plural, feminine, So what we have so far would say, he stationed at the top of the ridge his own legions, which he had drafted, and all the auxiliary troops. Okay, we have a prepositional phrase, in Gallia Citeriore. That means in nearer Gaul. Not the part of Gaul that's really far away, but the part that's nearer. So in Gallia Citeriore, in nearer Gaul. And then as you can see from the footnote, they want us to translate proxime as last. In other words, the most recent conscripts, the most recent people to be drafted into Caesar's army. Number 14 as a whole says this: at the top of the ridge, he stationed his own legions, which he had drafted last in nearer Gaul, and he stationed all the auxiliary troops. In my English translation, I repeated the word conlocavit. I said he stationed a second time. You don't have to do that. I just did it for clarity. Number 15 is next. Diu atque acreter pugnaverunt. Again, there is no dedicated noun here to be the subject, so we're just going to look at the verb pugnaverunt. That's a form of the verb pugno, which means fight. It's perfect tense, third person plural, so it means they fought. So our subject is they, and our verb is fought. Diu means for a long time. Atque can be translated as and also. And acreter is an adverb that means bitterly. So number 15 could say, they fought for a long time and also bitterly. Number 16 is next. Suis imperavit ne tela jacerent. Again, in this exercise, we do not have a noun that is dedicated to be the subject. So we need to look at our verb and find the pronoun included in the verb. Imperavit is the verb here. That means command. It's a form of the verb impero. And here it's third person singular, perfect tense. So imperavit will say he, she, or it commanded. And the verb impero, when you use it to say that someone is commanding someone to do something, the people that are being commanded to do something, you put that noun in the dative case. So that's why suis is here. Suis is dative plural. So suis and imperavit will say this: he commanded his own. And suis here is a substantive. You have to read into that his own troops, his own men, his own guys, his own soldiers, what have you. But the idea is that suis is a substantive that is standing on its own here as the object of imperavit. In fact, there's a note here. Footnote number 2 says, supply militibus. So if we put in the word militibus after suis, we get this: he commanded his own soldiers. And the rest of the sentence tells us what he commanded them to do or not to do. The word ne here is a big clue that he told them not to do something. Ne means not. In fact, ne, tela, and jacerent, those three words form a noun clause. In the last lesson, I believe, we talked a little bit about how this kind of construction has different names. Notice that jacerent is a subjunctive verb. Today's Latin teachers would refer to this as an indirect command. In Allen and Greenough, it's called a substantive clause of purpose. A little bit confusing. In Wheelock's Latin, they call it a jussive noun clause or something like that. So probably in a modern-day Latin class, the teacher would call this a negative indirect command, or perhaps some kind of prohibition. But regardless of what you call it, here's what's happening grammatically. He commanded his own soldiers that they not jacerent, that they not throw the tela, the javelins. Okay, so tela is accusative plural. That's the direct object of jacerent. And jacerent is a form of the verb jaccio, which means to throw. And here it's imperfect subjunctive. Notice that we're in secondary sequence here. Imperawit is perfect tense, and so we have an imperfect subjunctive here after that. So we're in secondary sequence, and the sentence reads, he commanded his own troops that they not throw the javelins. And you can throw in the word there, T-H-E-I-R, along with javelins. You could say not to throw their javelins, because that's the idea. It's what's being implied. A smoother way to say this in English would be like this. He commanded his own soldiers not to throw their javelins. Number 17 is next. Huic permissit uti in his locis legionem conlocaret. Number 17 has a structure somewhat similar to number 16. The words uti through conlocaret, through the end of the sentence, that area of the sentence is a noun clause. And as a clause, that whole clause is the direct object of permissit. Uti is just an alternate spelling of the word ut. So don't let the I confuse you. It's not the infinitive of utor. It's just an alternate spelling of ut. So permissit is actually one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. That's permitto, which means to allow or permit. And here it's perfect tense, third person singular. Again, there is no noun here to be the subject. We just have to look at the verb and find a pronoun that's included in the verb. So permissit would say he, she, or it allowed, or he, she, or it permitted. And then huic is a form of hic, haec, hoc. Hic, haec, hoc means this. So we have forms in the nominative, hic, haec, hoc. In the genitive, huius, huius, huius. And then huic is dative. Morphologically, huic could be masculine, feminine, or neuter. It's probably talking about some guy in some military context. So the idea here is permissit says he, she, or it permitted or allowed. And then the person that they are allowing or permitting is in the dative. So it says he permitted this guy. It could be because permissit is a compound verb, and so we have huic here as dative with compound verbs. But regardless of the reason why, huic is the party here that's being permitted or being allowed to do something. So that's hic, haec, hoc, but in the dative singular. So huic and permissit will say, he permitted this guy, or he permitted this man, something like that. Now, the rest of the sentence will tell us what the guy was or was not permitted to do. Again, uti is just an alternate spelling of ut, so we can translate it as that. And the main verb in here within our ut clause is conlocaret. That's an imperfect subjunctive, and it's a form of conloco, which is one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Conloco means to place or station or perhaps deploy. So huic permissit and uti and conlocaret together would say, he permitted this guy that he station. Legionem is the direct object of conlocaret. That's accusative singular. So what that gives us so far is he permitted this guy that he station a legion. Finally, in his locis means in these places. His is an ablative plural form of hic, haec, hoc. So the sentence as a whole reads, he permitted this guy that he station a legion in these places. If we wanted to put it into more colloquial English, smoother English, we could say, he permitted this man to station a legion in these places. Number 18 is next. It's just one word for practice. Conlocari is a form of one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson, conloco. Here we have a passive infinitive, a present infinitive that is. So conlocari says to be stationed or to be placed. If it were An active infinitive, to place or to station, it would have an E at the end, collocare. But with the long I there, it's passive, so it means to be stationed or to be placed. Number 19, conlocans. Again, they're letting us review some verb forms that we've learned in the past. This particular form is a present active participle. So conlocans means placing or stationing. Remember that present participles decline like third declension I stem nouns. 20 is next, conlocandi. Again, we're reviewing things from the past. Here we have a gerund that's in the genitive case. So conlocandi would say something like of stationing or of placing. Number 21, conlocandus. Again, we have more review. This is a future passive participle. Conlocandus would say something like to be placed, in the future, that is, or to be stationed in the future. This future passive participle functions as an adjective, conlocandus, conlocanda, conlocandum. It could take any of those forms. It communicates that something will happen passively. It communicates that something will happen in the future. And it has the connotation that something ought to be done or must be done. So conlocandus by itself means to be stationed or to be placed. If you put a verb of being with it, it would form a passive periphrastic, and it would mean something like it ought to be placed or it must be placed. A little bit of review there about future passive participles and passive periphrastics. Okay, that does it for this particular lesson. Thanks for sticking with me, thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time in Lesson 41.